Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with Alaska Weather and the National Weather Service. It is Thursday, February 5th, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date on your local weather information. If you are in Southeast, this is very important today because you're expecting heavy snow and you already have some strong winds blowing through the region. That will continue as we head through the night. Here are some of the headlines that we wanted to share with you. Pretty important stuff. We expect heavy snow. A lot more places are going to see the heavier snowfall than some of the strongest winds that have been blowing through Juneau, Douglas, and the Haines and Skagway regions already. In southeast Alaska, especially around Petersburg, Wrangell, Cake, and north of Ketchikan, that's where the heaviest snow seems to really be focused on. About 1 to 2 feet of snow is possible there, and winter storm warnings are posted right now, and they'll continue as we head into Friday and early Saturday there. About 14 to 28 inches for areas around Hyder, and generally north of Ketchikan is probably where the worst of that is going to be. On the other side of the storm system, out across the west coast and the Arctic coast, especially around the Brooks Range and north and the east side, you're expecting some dangerous wind chills. Winter weather advisories and wind chill advisories are posted in those areas for the north and western coast. So we're going to break this out into detail. Now, for southeastern Alaska, you'll see those areas shaded in red. These are warnings of some type. The winter storm warnings are generally from Juneau southward here and along the coastline. For these areas, you can expect a wide range of snowfall totals. It looks like some of the inner channel regions, all the way through Cake, Wrangell, Petersburg, places that we just mentioned there, 1 to 2 feet of snow in this general vicinity. The further south you go, especially south of Ketchikan, that's going to mix in with rain. It'll be a slushy, very wet, and probably heavy snow, but not as much snow as what you're expecting a little bit further into the central sections of southeast. Around Juneau, especially starting tomorrow around 9 o'clock or so to about 6 o'clock on Saturday morning, winter storm warnings are in effect for your area. 4 to 8 inches possible there. Around Angoon, 7 to 15 inches of snow is possible for your region. And again, around the Wrangell and Cake regions, you're expecting some pretty heavy snow. That could be upwards of 1 to 2 feet. Petersburg included in that. And for north of Heidelberg, about 6 to 10 inches of snow. So an awful lot going on in southeast on top of the high wind warnings that are in effect for the region right now. Those winds could be gusting upwards of 60 to 90 miles per hour. And you're encouraged, if you have storm damage, whether that's to your ship, your boat, your houseboat, your backyard, whatever. If it's trees, power lines, whatever, the National Weather Service would like to know about that because that helps us do a better job understanding the weather and what it does to your community when bad weather rolls through. So if you're on Twitter, this is really easy. Go to Twitter and at NWS Juneau with the hashtag AKwx, say, I've got some storm damage. This is what happened. If you have a picture, you use the location, all that stuff works out really well and can help us catalog those impacts there in your community, whether that's in Juneau, Sitka, Wrangell, Cake, Petersburg, Ketchikan, anywhere in southeast, that's going to help a lot. Now, the gusts that we've heard about today, some of those have been pretty potent. Around Juneau, I believe they're one of the stronger gusts earlier this afternoon, about 2 o'clock or so, was about 70 miles per hour. Haines, I believe, clocked a wind gust around 100 miles per hour. So the winds are going there in northern sections of southeast. Let's go up the road a little bit toward the Copper River Basin. A wind chill advisory is in effect there. We're expecting wind chill values to drop to about 45 below. Some of that's going to go through Friday and into Saturday morning for the Copper River Basin. The winds are blowing in the Mat-Su Valley, specifically the Matanuska Valley, I should say. It looks like some of those winds have been blowing on the order of 60 to 70 miles per hour. We expect that to continue at least until midnight tonight, so a high wind warning is in effect for the Matanuska Valley, with the exception of Butte. Butte's doing just fine. Not a whole lot of wind blowing through the Butte at this point. Those winds could gust from 60 to 75 again from the north and east, at least through the evening hours to about midnight. Around the Valdez region, especially around Thompson Pass, also talking about some pretty strong gusts, upwards of 70 to 80 miles per hour. That could create some poor visibility at times. The wind chill is probably an issue as well. It could make it feel like 45 below, so watch for high winds in the Thompson Pass region and dangerous wind chills to 45 below there. We'll come back to the YK Delta here in just a minute. Let's focus up northward. We have winter weather advisories for either side of the Brooks Range in the east side right now. We're expecting wind chill values again to about 50 to 55 below. South and westerly winds moving through the region will probably encourage that lower wind chill value to continue as we head into Friday and Saturday there. We're also watching for poor visibility. Visibility probably around a half mile or less at times, but probably hanging out around a half mile or so. So if you've got travel plans, especially in some of the passes, through some of the passes there, the weather's going to be noticeably poor in those areas, at least through Friday and into Saturday. Now for the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast, again, the wind chill advisories are in effect there. We're expecting those values to drop about 50 to 55 below. The same goes for the Chukchi Seacoast and also the YK Delta. We expect to see areas around Bethel and the villages there for the YK, looking at some pretty cool, feels like indices there. So it's going to feel about 15 to maybe 30 below at its coldest, not only tonight, but tomorrow night and into Sunday. So plan on some cold weather. The wind's going to continue to blow through this region, and with that, those wind chill values about 15 to 30 below. So plan on a lot of the West Coast just being generally uncomfortable as we go ahead in time. We're going to focus out on the North Pacific real quick and the Bering Sea before we turn our attention back to mainland Alaska here, but the same is still true as what we were talking about yesterday. You see the general flow moving from east to west around the Aleutians. High pressure is in charge of the Bering, and until that quits, the really active precipitation pattern or storms moving in from the west is not going to be possible. Right now, the jet stream is moving up and over through Alaska. That's dropping the cold down from the Arctic. That's keeping pretty tame weather across the Bering, considering the season. And it's allowing some stronger winds to blow off the bays and passes through southwestern Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula. The effects in aloft are showing the storm steering currents kind of taking this back and away from the Bering Sea and keeping things fairly calm and allowing that cold air to really settle in across the Bering and certainly the west coast with the wind and wind chill combined. Now southeast, that's a totally different story. And just like last night, we'll do a reprise here. I'm going to move to this side of the screen and out across the eastern part of the Gulf. Look at this beast. This low pressure system working up southeastern Alaska continues to drop in its pressure. I believe it was around 970, I think. We'll check the map here and see if I got that right in just a minute. But as this is deepening, it's opposing that very cold dome of high pressure that's been working across the central and western part of Yukon and certainly the interior. So all this cold air wants to get out of the interior in the Yukon. And where does it go? It finds the vacuum, it finds the weak spot through these channeled passes, White Pass, Chilkoot Pass, and all the way down the Lynn Canal. And it is just trying to fill the vacuum, which is low pressure, out across the eastern Gulf and the Pacific Northwest. This is really latched into a lot of moisture. If you could see even bigger view, I wish I had one of those for you. This extends into a big plume of moisture well to the south, and you'll see that that pattern here with the jet stream in just a few minutes. But this is all connected to a huge source of moisture, and some of that, just some of that, is making its way into southern parts of southeast, and that is just creating a tremendous opportunity for snow across central and southern parts of southeast. Again, 1 to 2 feet of snow in Wrangell and Petersburg and Cake. All those areas could see that much snow by the end of the weekend there. So tremendous opportunities there for snow. And Juneau not to be excluded again. Not 2 feet of snow, but it looks like you could get your fair share there with amounts upwards of probably 4 to 8 inches there, but you're also dealing with the wind at this point too. Here's a look at the satellite loop one more time. Low pressure is working up southeast, the dry and cold air across the Yukon and across the interior. We do have these minor disturbances. They look minor on the satellite, let me phrase it that way, as they're crossing from west to east across the Arctic. Just enough to really get the wind stirred up, maybe squeeze out a little bit of snow for the Brooks Range, especially the eastern side there. But more than anything else, it is a wind maker, and that is changing the way the weather feels, dropping that wind chill index, and keeping the wind stirring up the snow across the surface there. Everything else out across the west generally tame. We've got unsettled weather across the central and western chain with rain and snow showers there, rain across Unalaska and Dutch Harbor today. But really most areas are just dry and clear. with the wind moving through south central. So here's the weather map there. I drew in a cold front. There is a little bit of a temperature change across the north, but it's kind of minor. It's a little bit questionable. The front will be moving through fairly quickly there, just as the last one did. Low pressure across the east, that was close, 968 millibars. As that continues working northward, there's moisture wrapped up in this. It will spread that snow further and further northward there. The blizzard warning, though, around White Pass has been discontinued and dropped at this point from the National Weather Service office in Juneau. The tight packing of the pressure gradient tells us there's probably some wind, as there has been around the Matanuska Valley today. Light rain around Cordova. Breezy in Valdez today. We understand winds were blowing around 50 miles per hour there, so just kind of a garden variety day for you, right? Some light rain around the eastern part of the Aleutians, and you can see that moisture plume wrapping into this, but kind of a disorganized system there on the south side of the chain. As we go into tonight, we'll continue to see opportunities for rain and snow closer to the southeastern coastline of the Gulf. Inland, a little bit further into the interior and the inner channels, that's going to become some heavy snow. So places like Petersburg, Wrangell, and Cake, north of Ketchikan, you're going to get pounded there with some snow. So plan on some heavy snow, and the winds will continue across areas like Juneau and Douglas and into Skagway and Haines. High pressure sitting just north of the Alcan border there in southeast. 1,026 millibars. Doesn't sound like a big system, but when you combine it with a ridge that extends into the interior, all of that is feeding into the storm, and it is pulling that air southward through southeast tonight. Blowing and drifting snow for the Alaska range, and then worse, probably more areas of poor visibility across the Brooks Range. Not a whole lot of snow falling, but snow blowing will be the issue there, as well as wind chills. Spotty areas of rain and snow showers for the chain. Most of the west coast will be dry, as well as Kodiak Island, and wind chill values again will be a little bit on the miserable side, 15 to 30 below for southwest. And if you're in the Arctic coast, you're saying, yeah, that's not that big of a deal. But for southwest, you know, a long duration pattern of that, it's going to be pretty uncomfortable. So make sure you're protecting yourself and your loved ones if you have to go outside for any length of time in that kind of cold. Friday, the low pressure system's working northward, still just south of Sitka and Port Alexander at 972 millibars. Look at the pressure pattern here, the snow, all of that is still working its way westward. Probably the heaviest amounts of snow still east of Yakutat, so it doesn't look like you're going to get in on as much of that as places like Juneau and Skagway and areas down the coast will. That warm air is just northwest of the Pacific Northwest and sitting right along the British Columbia coast, so most of southeast is going to be involved in the snow. Out across the west, spotty areas of rain and snow showers still along and south of the chain, and then west toward Attu. The west coast, breezy, areas of blowing and drifting snow for the interior, and the same will be true for Saturday. Another weak wave of low pressures just kind of cruising through the Arctic coast. That'll stir up some snow showers, keep the snow blowing around, probably keep the wind chills down. And notice our low pressure system across the Gulf kind of expands and kind of reaches out across more of the north and western coast. So coastal areas of snow should be possible. That could include Kodiak Island. Southeast is still going to be breezy, but the strongest winds will probably be a lot closer to Cordova, just outside of Prince William Sound, and from Yakutat out toward the Cross Sound region. There will be some pockets of rain and snow across southeast, but the heaviest will be winding down as we get into Saturday night and Sunday. So a very active period for southeast. Temperature-wise now, 20s and 30s for southeast today. A lot of wind in the north. 20s and 30s for Prince William Sound. Cordova was 33. Anchorage 19. Homer was 30 degrees. 28 around Talkeetna and Squentna. 18 below in Fairbanks. 29 below in Eagle. Anywhere from 20 to 32 below around the Arctic coast today. Looked like Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse was one of the colder spots. Kotzebue Sound from 5 to 15 below today. Shishmaref was 4. 1 above in Nome. Unalakleet was 7 above, 7 below in McGrath, 2 above in Bethel. Teens and 20s for southwestern Alaska, 20s, 30s, even a few 40s there for the Alaska Peninsula today. Kodiak was 36, right at the freezing point in the Pribilovs, and low 40s for Adak and Atka. Overnight low temperatures, ouch, Fort Yukon 50 below, 15 to 25 below, even colder in places like Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse tonight. 2 below in Nome, southwest looking at 5 to 10 below, a little bit milder in Dillingham. 28 above in Kodiak, 20s and 30s for the chain and the Alaska Peninsula, with south central and the teens and probably upper teens tomorrow. 34 in Kodiak, 20s, teens and 20s for a large part of southeast. A few areas like maybe Craig and Klawock closer to 40 degrees. You'll have a better chance for rain mixed with snow, and anywhere from 15 to 20 below for the Arctic coast. So a lot of cold still hanging on in the interior. IFR conditions should be expected for Kaktovik and areas along the Chukchi Seacoast through the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island. MVFR for the western Bering and most of the central and western chain. and pretty poor flying conditions, not to be left out for southeast, of course. We would expect some transitional weather toward IFR across some of the northern passes. South central right now, things look pretty clear all the way around the Alaska range. Let's take a look. In AKwx Pass, MVFR with improvement through the day toward VFR, and same goes for Adigan Pass. We expect morning snow showers and then lessening of the wind, and any blowing snow should improve slowly throughout the day. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, as well as Rainy and Windy Pass, we expect to see VFR conditions. Isabel Pass, also onward toward Mentasta Pass and Tanita Pass, things should be VFR conditions there. Breezy, maybe not the best flying day, but as far as visibility goes, things should be okay. Portage Pass looks VFR at this point, and as you look over at Chilkoot and White Pass, again, worsening weather with more snow developing into the daytime, and VFR toward IFR conditions are expected. Your freezing levels show that warm and wet air lifting northward, but on top of that is the surface freezing line. That is dropping southward, actually below it. And with that, we got our big weather maker across southeast. Also some pockets of warmer air out across southwest and across the eastern chain. That's running around 2,000 feet. Everything else, of course, is below freezing at this point. Icing potential, there is certainly some of that, occasional to widespread moderate across southeastern Alaska, generally above 8,000 feet, and you are going to see some pretty poor visibility there. Above 4,000 feet across the central chain and out west. Other than that, below 10,000 feet across the Arctic coast, just a little bit of moisture. And with that, we'll say light icing potential there. High pressure sitting across the Bering Sea. That is the story of the winter, it sounds like. And with that, that cold air just dropping southward, but a fairly pronounced ridge underneath that. That is helping to encourage that storm system across southeastern Alaska. Wind speeds there aloft at 50 knots. And then you throw in the 9,000 foot winds there with a strong circulation. South and southwesterlies coming in at 40 knots there. A driving northerly flow down the west coast, 35 to as high as 50 knots as you get closer to Pilot Point in areas around False Pass and Cold Bay. High pressure sitting around the Gulf of Anadyr, driving in northwesterly winds at 30 to 45 right into the Bering Strait. That continues at 30,000 feet. 3,000 feet, I should say. Northerlies coming down through the eastern chain at 50 knots. Low pressure sitting pretty much the same spot there in southeast, and winds are generally lighter across the interior at 15 to 20 knots with northwesterlies across the Arctic coast. So turbulence, sure, there's going to be some across the Arctic coast with occasional moderate there below 4,000 feet, below 6,000 feet, widespread from Norton Sound and north of the Killbuck Mountains there, and just north of Bristol Bay, below 6,000. Watch for some even isolated severe around the Matanuska Valley tonight and into early tomorrow morning, and through Cook Inlet, a better chance for occasional moderate. Some of that across Prince William Sound as well. And for southeastern Alaska, we're going to hold on to the widespread moderate and some isolated severe from areas north of Cake and Petersburg into the Chilkoot and White Pass region, again below 8,000 feet. So a tricky flying day in southeast and kind of a bumpy day for the rest of south central and southwestern Alaska and points in the north. That's a look at your aviation forecast. Back with more marine weather here in just a few minutes.
The Valentine's Day Stars. Hey there, stargazers. I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida.
And I'm Dean Regas, astronomer for the Cincinnati Observatory. If you want to give your sweetheart something special and out of this world for Valentine's Day, we have a trio of exquisitely beautiful objects in the cosmos, gift-wrapped and ready to present.
Let's show you. Okay, we've got our skies set up for Valentine's night, Saturday, February 14th, after sunset facing west, where you'll see an exquisitely beautiful, dazzlingly brilliant object that may look like a star, but a star it is not. It is instead the brightest planet we can see from the Earth. The planet named for, what else? The Roman goddess of love, 8,000-mile-wide Venus.
If you have a telescope, take a look at Venus, and you'll see that Venus is not quite round. Venus is on the other side of the solar system, so it's much smaller now than it will be this summer when it will be much, much closer.
Let's take a look at how Venus will change its appearance over the next few months. Here's our gibbous Venus right now, and let's speed up time and watch as Venus changes its phase and gets much larger as it gets closer to the Earth in its orbit over the next 6 months. Quite a change, huh?
But you can celebrate this Valentine's Day by first showing your loved one the super bright planet of the goddess of love shining down on both of you. which will be prettier than any Valentine's Day card out there.
Then, for a super special cosmic Valentine, look due south between the hours of 8 and 9 p.m. and you'll see a very bright red star shining above the horizon. In fact, it's the brightest red star we can see with the naked eye from planet Earth. And just coincidentally, it reaches its highest point above the horizon every Valentine's Day between the hours of 8 and 9 p.m.
It marks the shoulder star of the great sky giant Orion the Hunter, and its name is Betelgeuse, which most people pronounce Beetlejuice. And if you've ever wanted to give your loved one a really big Valentine, well, this is about as big as it gets. If we compare Betelgeuse, the Valentine star, with our own star, the Sun, and our own planet, the Earth, you'll understand just how big. Our Earth is 8,000 miles wide, which means it's pretty dinky compared to our Sun, which is 865,000 miles wide. In fact, we could fit over 1 million Earths inside our Sun. Betelgeuse, however, is so huge we could fit over 160 million of our suns inside it. And that's just when Betelgeuse is at its smallest size.
We say smallest size because Betelgeuse changes its size regularly like a gigantic, slowly pulsating heart, one that beats, however, only once every 6 years.
When Betelgeuse is fully contracted and at its smallest size, it is still about 500 times the width of our Sun. But when it expands to the biggest size, it is almost 900 times as wide.
Or, if you care to think of it this way, if we could place Betelgeuse where our Sun is, when Betelgeuse is at its smallest, it would stretch out past the orbits of Mercury, Venus, Earth, and all the way to Mars. But when it's at its largest, it will reach all the way out to Jupiter. Wow.
So, that's Venus in the west after sunset,
the red heart star Betelgeuse in the south,
and if you turn and look east, you'll spot Jupiter the King. It is the biggest and almost the brightest planet we can see from Earth, the planet named for the Roman king of the gods. If you have binoculars or a telescope, just take a look at Jupiter on Valentine's night and look for a close pair of lights above Jupiter. They are two of Jupiter's moons, Io and Europa. And you can watch them separate after an early evening kiss that night.
So, there you have it, a brilliant planet named for the king of the gods right after sunset in the east, in the west the planet of love, Venus, and due south between 8 and 9 p.m., and at its highest, the biggest cosmic Valentine you'll ever want to give, Betelgeuse, a giant red star slowly beating like a heavenly heart for your sweetheart, courtesy of our local galaxy.
Is this a romantic cosmos or what? Keep looking up.
On top of snow and wind, it's just going to be a generally unsettled day for Southeast. So once again, mariners and aviators, check your weather forecast several times before you head out the door and out to the tarmac or the dock. 50 knots and higher gusts across the Lynn Canal for tomorrow. 17-foot seas in the Lynn Canal, up to 9-foot seas there for Stevens Passage, and 7-foot seas into Clarence Strait. Winds still going strong to 45 knots. Southeasterlies opposing that in Clarence Strait. Northeasterlies roaring off the coastline. 50 knots there in the north, 17-foot seas, 40-knot winds there as you head further south of Sitka, 14 to 16-foot seas outside of the Dixon entrance. Things are improving on Saturday, but you're still going to have some choppy conditions and some gusts lingering in the region. 30-knot winds sustained, though, out of Lynn Canal and further southward. Southeasterlies opposing that into Clarence Strait, 4-foot seas are expected, and winds become south and southeasterly, still feeding into low pressure that's moving away from southeastern Alaska. 25 to 30-knot winds are expected with seas as high as 10 to 12 feet in the north and 9 to 14 feet in the south there on Saturday. Now for South Central, the winds will be out of the north and northeast, coming through Prince William Sound at 30 knots with higher gusts certainly out of the Copper River Basin and around Valdez. 25 to 40 knots there coming out of Resurrection Bay and down the western Gulf coastline. Northerlies on either side of the Barrens from 35 to 40 knots. The strongest will be on the east side, and north and northeasterly winds coming down Cook Inlet. Look for 35-knot winds east of Kodiak Island with 11-foot seas there by Saturday. Winds are picking up now outside of Prince William Sound and east of the Kenai Peninsula. 45-knot winds there with 11 to 13-foot seas and still looking at some higher gusts. Northeasterlies still going strong in Prince William Sound and 30 to 40 knots down Cook Inlet. 35 knots west of the Barrens and 30 knots in Shelikof Strait with a 12-foot sea. Across the Alaska Peninsula, the Bering side, 25 to 35 knots. Still looking at ice there across Bristol Bay, 20 to 25 knots there with 9-foot seas on the Pacific side for Friday. Winds are going to pick up there west of Castle Cape to Chignik, 40 knots with a 12-foot sea, 35 knots on the Bering Sea coast with 14-foot seas on the Bering Sea coast side there north of Cold Bay. For the Alaska Peninsula, for the Aleutians, I should say, 20 to 25 knots for the Bering Sea coast, 20 knots on the Pacific coast, 7 to 8-foot seas there with 25 knots from the east across Kiska to Attu with 11-foot seas. That's going to stay about the same for Saturday. Look for north and easterly winds continuing on the Bering Sea coast at 30 knots and 25 to 30 knots there south of Nikolsky to Unalaska with a 9-foot sea on Saturday. For the west coast, northerlies driving across St. Lawrence Island at 30 knots down to Nunivak Island. 5-foot seas outside of Kuskokwim Bay with a 35-knot wind, and watch for the freezing spray in the vicinity of the ice edge once again. Northeasterlies around the Pribilofs, 35 knots with a 12-foot sea. As we head into Saturday, that looks like that turns a little bit more to the north. 30 knots diminishes a little bit there. 11-foot seas around the Pribilofs with a northeasterly flow around St. Matthew, and a 9-foot sea is expected there with freezing spray still an issue. Some of that may be heavy at times in the Bering. Northwesterlies around the Arctic coast for Friday. Look for those winds around 20 to 25 knots. More of a northerly flow inside of Kotzebue Sound and just outside at 20 knots up to 30 knots on Saturday and increasing. Northerlies then blowing right into the Arctic coast. It promises to be a cold day, 20 to 25 knots there from Barrow out toward Kaktovik. A little bit more of a northwesterly flow also at 20 knots on Saturday. Recapping tonight's weather, high winds and heavy snow are going to be an issue for southeastern Alaska. Winter storm warnings for the central and southern parts of southeast. High wind warnings continue around Juneau and Douglas and around the White Pass region for Skagway. Blizzard warnings have been dropped, but do expect some parts of central and southern southeast to pick up 1 to 2 feet of snow. That is certainly possible with this weather system. High winds continue around Matsu, a high wind warning until midnight there for winds 60 to 75 miles per hour. Wind chill advisories also posted for the Copper River Basin and the Arctic coast with winter weather advisories for the YK as well. Thanks for watching. See you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.